Good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and welcome to the grand final of the New Zealand Initiative's Next Generation Debates, fresh perspectives on the big social issues. My name is Oliver Hartwig and I'm the Executive Director of the New Zealand Initiative. Welcome to you all. Before we start, big thanks to the Friedlander Foundation for their very generous support for this project. Without it, this tournament would not have happened. Ernst & Young and Lion have also kindly supported it. As I think you all know, the aim of the tournament is to get people, especially young people, thinking and talking about public policy issues and understanding why they matter. This is the New Zealand Initiative's mission too, promoting sound public policies that will make for a better standard of living for all New Zealanders. The debate tonight is the culmination of 6 preliminary debates and 2 hard-fought semi-finals last week. Our Auckland semi-final was even broadcast on The Nation last weekend. I want to thank the Canterbury and Otago teams for the very spirited effort they put into the earlier debates. They've slugged it out over a great range of topics, from same-sex adoption and Chinese investment in New Zealand to banning smoking and raising the drinking age. We've seen some very fine debates. The teams that made it through to tonight's final are Auckland and Victoria, and the mood for the grand final tonight is that we need higher taxes on the rich. Victoria is affirming. I should hasten to explain that the position reflected in the mood is designed to make for a good debate and is not necessarily the view of the New Zealand Initiative. Nor do the debaters in fact get to choose which side they are on. We toss a coin for that. But we do take an interest in these issues around tax levels in New Zealand and how they affect our economy. So it should be very interesting to see how the arguments play out tonight. Tonight's debaters count among the best in New Zealand. Richard Darth and Esha Emanuel are representing Victoria University. Richard has a Bachelor of Laws with honours and is completing a Bachelor of Science with majors in Physics and English Literature. He won the Australasian Championships in 2010. Esha is a 3rd year of Law and English Literature student. He's won the Easters Debating Tournament twice and the Joint Scroll Competition once. And representing the University of Auckland are Joshua Baxter and Nupur Upadhyay. Josh is in the 3rd year of Law and Arts. His arts majors are politics and philosophy. Josh has won the Trophy Debating Championship and was an octo-finalist at the Australasian Debating Championships. Nupur is a 4th year Commerce and Law honours student. She's a 2-time octo-finalist at the Australasian Championships and a quarter-finalist at the World Universities Debating Championships. Our adjudicators tonight are Christopher Bishop, Jonathan Orpin and Daniel Wilson. Chris is president of the New Zealand Schools Debating Council, a live member of the New Zealand Universities Debating Council, and has adjudicated the grand final of the World Universities Debating Champs. Chris, who's competed in this tournament in the past, is now the New Zealand Corporate Affairs Manager for Philip Morris, and I'm sure his debating skills come in handy there. Jonathan is a former member of the New Zealand University's impromptu and prepared debating teams and was a semi-finalist at the 2004 World Universities Debating Championships. He's a barrister, specializing in commercial litigation and public law at Stout Street Chambers in Wellington. Daniel, a former winner of the Sir David Beattie Cup for public speaking, is secretary of the Wellington Speaking Union and was co-convener of the 2012 Australasian InterVarsity Debating Championships. He's a 4th year science and law student at Victoria University. And finally, the format for tonight's debate. Each speaker has 7 minutes. There will be bells at 6 and at 7 minutes, and each team has a 3-minute right of reply with bells at 2 and 3 minutes. Points of information will be taken, and after the debate there will be a panel discussion with Stephen Franks and Peter Conway. But for now, without further ado, I would welcome Victoria to affirm the mood that we need higher taxes on the rich. Thank you.
It truly grieves me to be the bearer of bad news on this occasion. But it's the truth that the promises of neoliberalism have utterly failed us. The promise that freer markets would be the end of privilege and accumulations of absurd wealth, the end of those things which are inimical to freedom. The opposite has occurred. Privilege has run amok, and accumulation of wealth and the inequalities of that are more entrenched than ever. And so it's our goal on this side of the House today to restore our society to a situation of proper equality, one where meritocracy can truly flourish as we always hoped that it would. How we're going to do this is quite simple. We want a much steeper effective tax rate on people who have a lot of money. We recognise that a policy that focuses simply on higher income tax is myopic and doesn't understand the true situation in terms of the economics of taxation. That's why we support a very broad base of taxation, one which focuses on things like land and capital gains, inheritance taxes and those kind of things, the preserves of large accumulations of wealth, and the mechanisms by which people are able to entrench their privilege in our community. We think there's two consequences of that kind of policy. The first one is that we quite obviously increase the revenue for the state, and the state can use those funds to ameliorate the suffering of people who have been disadvantaged by the accident of birth. Secondly, we think we're going to make people more equal, and we think that that is a prima facie good, and we're going to demonstrate that today. We also support the strengthening of anti-avoidance provisions. We don't like it when people simply try to get around their taxes. 4 substantive points for you. First of all, I'm going to quickly canvass the moral duties to pursue this policy. They're quite simple and should be obvious to us all. We won't need to spend much time on that. Secondly, I'm going to talk about tangible benefits for everybody involved in the community, both rich and poor. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about how we're going to restore principles of meritocracy and have a functioning system of social mobility through this policy. Rich is going to tell you about political capture that happens when you have absurd accumulations of wealth. Let's talk now about these moral justifications for interference, because we recognise that if we're going to take people's property and people's efforts, we have to justify that in some way. The first reason is that we have a moral duty to ameliorate the suffering of others. An omission to ameliorate the suffering of somebody who is in poverty is a wrong act. A failure to act, and in fact involving yourself in a system of economics which perpetuates that harm, is a damage to your conscience. That's why we think it's justified for the state to intervene and take your resources and distribute them to limit suffering. Secondly, on a utilitarian perspective, we think that there's diminishing marginal returns of wealth. This is a question of whether or not it's better for somebody to spend $1 billion on a mega yacht, or whether or not that money would be better spent on investing in things like food for children whose families are unable to provide that for them themselves. That's the utility of money to two different parties, and that should create a stark image of why redistribution can provide utilitarian benefits to us on this side of the house. That's why we want to redistribute towards a situation of equality. The final one, and perhaps the most important one, is that wealth and our current situations of accumulations of wealth is arbitrary and unjust. On Nozikian principles of wealth transfer, people have acquired wealth in ways which were not fair, which were not just, through generations of class oppression and economic systems which repressed people from the opportunity to get their fair share of the distribution of resources. Through the accident of birth, people are born into families which may or may not be wealthy. That's not through their merit, that's not through their strength of character, that's simply because they were lucky enough to have the right parents happen to encounter one another. That's not a fair reason to dictate somebody's outcomes in life. We're going to change that. Let's talk about the suffering now from inequality. This is the practical consequences of inequality. And the important thing to understand here about our case is that it's not just that poverty is a problem, but the actual inequality of persons in material terms in a society causes substantial harms. Poverty, yes, is a relative and relational measure. That is the fact of the matter, that it is a situation of relationships between wealthy and poor. The cause of much of the harm is actually the very fact of that inequality. First of all, education and opportunity. On the face of it, there's an uneven distribution of resources between people in wealthy schools and poor schools. That's a reason for the state to intervene and better spread wealth to the right institutions. But moreover, when you have a very wealthy class and a poor class, you have substantially divergent interests between those people. There's less interest in improving the quality of our public education system. Because when your child is going to the local private school, there's very little interest for you in investing your time and your efforts and the encouragement of your political capital for the Decile 1 school right around the corner to be providing a high quality of education to all people. Through those kind of inequalities, we deny people the opportunity to ever get onto the ladder of meritocracy. Moreover, we think that the inequalities in our system of education perpetuates particularly Darwinist narratives, and we think that upper classes are able to deny the capacity of lower classes to ever elevate themselves, and that further removes the apparent moral responsibility on them to ever intervene and try and improve that situation. Health outcomes. The very fact of having an inequality of wealth reduces your life expectancy. That is a fact. The Whitehall surveys, which surveyed the British civil servants, all of which had access to exactly the same healthcare, demonstrated that the lower you were down in the rung of social status and the stresses and anxieties that created as a result negatively harmed your life expectancy. The very fact of inequality causes mental health problems and stress, early death and chronic illness. This is a gradient that exists across society. Bringing these groups and classes closer together, returning focus to the public healthcare system in a moment, Josh, improves the health outcomes of all people involved. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you support
support a maximum wage. Do I support a maximum wage? No, I don't. I think that that would cause unnecessary economic distortions, and we're better to pursue the goal of equality through policies which target things which are easy to tax and easy to redistribute without massive harms to efficiency. So I know I don't. So moreover, in the healthcare system, that same analysis in terms of education applies once more. That's why this national government has introduced a whole lot more funding for elective surgeries. Those are things which are by definition less important than things which were not elective surgeries, things which people actually need. That's because there is political capture where the wealthy class, who is the electorate of the current government, are the ones who want elective surgeries and capture public funds and drag them away from people who are impoverished. Moreover, there's higher levels of violence. This is why our policy benefits rich people, because they're less likely to get mugged. The very fact of being unequal, being unable to compete in the status competition of our materialist world by having an iPhone, by having a fenced community, by having a swimming pool, is a cause of violence and unrest and a lack of social cohesion in our community. In monkeys, it's demonstrated that when you give food to one monkey, it becomes more jealous and more violent towards the other one, particularly when that distribution of resources is unjust. The same thing bears out in the United States, not simply because the citizens are quite similar to monkeys much of the time. People use violence as an alternate way of competing in that competition of life. Finally, meritocracy, and this is the worst thing about the whole situation. Meritocracy is a lie, the belief that inequalities are not arbitrary and not unjust, because we tell ourselves that everybody has the same capacity if they just work hard enough, if they try hard enough and participate in the community. That's not the case. Nepotism governs because we have massive concentrations of wealth in a small class of people. And it's not a surprise, everybody, that those people's preference for the people that they employ, the people that they grant social status to, cohere very much with accumulations of wealth and being in the same class of them. That's a lie which allows us to remain blind to inequalities and the harms that that does to absolutely everybody. It's not a common occasion for me in debating to be able to say this, but I can say right now I truly am proud to support this motion.
Ladies and gentlemen, in a recent report released by the Treasury, it was observed that in 2000, when the top marginal tax rate was raised to 39%, the government actually collected less tax revenue. We say that on our side of the house, it is principally unfair to have higher taxes upon the rich for the investment and the work and the effort they've put in to redeem that profit, but we also think it's really bad for everybody else in society in terms of the egalitarian outcomes that Asher wanted to achieve. I'm going to show you why in my speech. So first of all, I'm going to talk to you about equality. Do we actually need it? Do we think it's an ideal we want to stand for? And to the extent that it is, we think we can get it with our model. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you about why we think the wealthy will pay their share under our model. And finally, I'm going to talk about who spends this money better to achieve societal outcomes. We think it's when that money stays in the hands of the rich. So the model we propose is basically a 20% flat tax. We would have that for everybody in society. We'd cut middle class welfare. So policies like working for families, policies like interest-free student loans, and finally, we would remove GST off essentials. So let's talk first of all about equality. We say, first of all, that we agree with Asher, right? People should have a minimum standard of healthcare, they should have a minimum standard of education. And we say that we can achieve those outcomes, that equality of opportunity, to allow people to get out of the situation that they're in and improve their lot in life through a 20% flat tax. We say that that allows everybody to have ensured certain equal opportunities and equal outcomes, and we're happy for that to stand on our side of the house. We say that beyond that obligation to provide everybody with a basic standard of living, the rich have no greater an obligation to anybody else in society than the poor or somebody who is middle class. We say they have absolutely no association with anybody else in society, no duty to them, no relationship to them, no thank you. We say that the fact that they've pursued their own path through tertiary education, through entrepreneurship, through whatever means through which they gathered their vast amounts of wealth, hasn't taken away or impacted upon the opportunity of anybody else in society to better their own situation. We say because they have not in any way in pursuing their own profits diminished anybody else's rights or their choices or their opportunities, we don't think they have any actual obligation or duty to anybody else. We say that it is unfair in fact unfair to impose upon them this artificial, arbitrary duty over and above what everybody else in society has, simply because they earn more money because they've put in the investment to do so. And we're happy to stand for them keeping their profits. But we also say that it's far better not to tax them more, because we think that the wealthy pay their share under our system more than they pay their share under their system. Because when you increase the amount of tax that you charge somebody who is wealthy, you decrease the amount of tax they actually pay, and you decrease the government revenue that actually wanted to use to do all of those things. Why? First of all, we say because when people are taxed more, they're inclined to work less. And you see this in a number of countries. For example, in France, where they have higher tax rates, people are proven to work fewer hours than places like the United States. We say that as you move up the income bracket and your marginal tax rate increases, the extra tax that you have to pay massively erodes the extra income that you would get. So we say for that reason, people are less inclined or less willing to work more when the tax rates are that high. And that's problematic for the productivity in our economy. Secondly, we say it puts a greater incentive to evade tax or avoid tax. And we say it is in fact the very wealthy who have the opportunity and the means to be able to hire very experienced trust lawyers, very experienced tax lawyers to structure their affairs in arrangements that mean that they're able to avoid paying any of that tax. And we say that that's a bad thing. But thirdly, we say that often they put their money offshore, so it's not subject to tax and they can still access all of the profits that they make. We say the fact that 1/3 of this world's wealth is held in offshore accounts in places like Switzerland and the Cayman Islands goes to show that when people are facing high amounts of individual tax and that they don't want to pay, they're going to send that money offshore. That's even worse for New Zealand because it doesn't stay in our banks where people can access that money as a form of investment to draw on. But finally, we say that these individuals leave New Zealand. We already have a huge problem in terms of the brain drain in this country. We say that it's often the most talented people, the wealthiest people, that have the greatest ability to be mobile across the world and across the country. And the fact that people like Owen Glenn and Alan Gibb have come out and said that the reason that they've left New Zealand is because of the high tax rates that they're subject to is a prime example of the fact that we lose some of our best people in this country if they're subjected to tax. So we say that you don't actually increase the revenue of the state like they claim, and that means that their model fails on that count. But moreover, we also say that a decrease in tax rates, like would happen if we implemented the 20% flat tax for the highest tax bracket, would generate more money. And we see that when Thatcher in the United Kingdom and in 1986 with the US decrease in tax rates and the tax reform there, it actually increased taxable income. Why? Because low tax rates attract companies and they attract individuals to our country to come to set up their businesses, to pay tax to us when we have clear legal structures and a low tax rate. We say that when more people come to New Zealand attracted by that low tax rate, you have more money to tax. So you get to tax all of that 20% of those new people rather than 0% that we tax them now. Yeah.
All of those effects that you just cited were in situations where income taxes were lowered. What happens when you have taxes on land and capital gains and other things which cannot be so easily moved?
First of all, we say that if you have a capital gains tax, for example, or a land tax, that's exactly the reason that people won't come to New Zealand anymore and will choose to invest in other countries or move to Australia or go to places where they don't have those kinds of tax structures. But also we say that we think it's principally unfair to tax those things, like I told you in my first point, because we don't think there's any added obligation owed by wealthy people to people, the rest of the people in society, beyond a basic standard of living, which we think is provided for under our model. So let's look at who spends this money better, because we say that when you generate wealth in the hands of the rich, those rich people don't just sit on that money, ladies and gentlemen. We say they use it to buy different things or to invest in different things. So they use it to buy yachts or goods and services because they have very deep pockets. That helps the rest of the people in the economy, exactly the middle class people or the people out there looking for jobs that they wanted to talk about, because they need to hire carpenters or electricians or courier drivers. We say that it's exactly that kind of investment in goods and services, investments in non-residential assets like factories or office buildings or oil wells, all of those things that contribute to GDP and actually give jobs to people that they want to talk about, that helps spread the wealth throughout society, not exorbitantly taxing very rich people who will either move away or stop spending money, which will have flow-on negative effects on the economy. We think that's worse for those people. We say that there's a reason that countries like Ireland now have a higher GDP per capita than countries like the United Kingdom and France. We say it's because they have very, very low tax rates and a flat tax structure. It's that structure that attracts people to their country, allows them to invest, allows them to spend, increases their GDP, and definitely spreads the wealth, which is the outcome that they're trying to achieve. That's why we oppose.
That was a bit weird. It was almost as if Asher's speech didn't happen, because I don't think at any point in Napur's speech he actually acknowledged a single point we made. So unfortunately my speech is going to consist a lot of repeating the brilliant material Asher brought, but also reminding you why it actually deals with their case. Because we did establish why rich people have a moral duty to give up their income to ameliorate suffering and to increase the utility of our society. We established why inequality, i.e. the mere fact that some people are richer than others, actually creates social harm at all levels of society. It makes society non-meritocratic, it makes it more violent, and it makes situations for a lot of people that result in health outcomes that are terrible and general happiness levels which are dire. Those are all problems they need to deal with, Josh, and it's really kind of unfortunate we have to wait till then. 3 points: rebuttal, inequalities, and politics, and the rich. So let's start with the points about obligations. Napur stood up and said, there is no obligation on the rich to help others because they did not cause their suffering. Well, actually there are several obligations that Asher gave you. First one, we believe that people have a general duty to ameliorate suffering when they can. We saw no distinction between omissions and commissions. Refraining from helping someone is as morally reprehensible as harming them directly. That clearly came out of Asher, not responded to. Refraining from helping people by paying a higher share of tax is immoral. The government should step in and intervene. We said you had an obligation to maximise the utility of those around you, because a billionaire doesn't need another yacht when that yacht could buy a lot of bread and shoes for poor orphans in New Zealand's poorest suburbs. We could maximise the health and happiness of our society. The government has a duty to do that. It's a duty they have to acknowledge. Thirdly, actually, they said, oh, they're not guilty of wrongdoing, except we gave you the Nozikian analysis, which says that most rich people are rich because of things like colonialism, where actually ancestors stripped assets from other people. Since the origins of that wealth was not legitimate, they have no moral legitimate claim to them, and it's perfectly legitimate for us to take them. Unfortunately not new, but something that Napur needs to deal with. Higher tax takes and apparently the Treasury report. We actually did read the Treasury report. That's why our model was so clever, right? Because we said that a myopic focus on income taxation can result in a situation where people avoid tax. That's why we said we'll tax land and inheritance and capital gains and have a broad taxation system which is harder to avoid. Furthermore, we'd say the primary reason why tax takes have gone up in the last 10 years is because of vigorous enforcement of the anti-avoidance provisions of the Income Tax Act, something that we support and will continue to strengthen. So we clearly get a higher tax rate take on this side of the house. Flat taxation, apparently fairer. Neglects to mention the point that it would mean that the tax rate doubles for the bottom 2 quintiles of our society, but, they'll be paying their fair share. I'm sorry, doubling the tax rate for some of New Zealand's most marginal people so you can half the tax rate for New Zealand's wealthiest doesn't seem particularly fair, and it doesn't seem particularly equitable to me. We needed a stronger defence than we got from that side of the house. What did they say? Firstly, rich people will work less. No, they won't. Why? Because people work for a whole bunch of reasons that aren't necessarily tied to the absolute income that they can get, right? They work for status. They work to be the richest person on their block, and if everyone's taxed the same rate, they can still try and achieve that. They work because they enjoy working. They enjoy being successful and striving to be the best that they can. And secondly, they still want to maximise their income with the constraints the government imposes upon them. Yes, they won't be able to buy the third yacht, the second yacht is still pretty dandy. And that's why no study has shown that increasing marginal tax rates actually results in people working less hours. No, Josh. Last point then that came out of Napur's speech. Everyone's going to go GOT and go overseas, and we'll never see them again. Lots of reasons to believe that this won't happen. Firstly, we broadly support other jurisdictions aligning themselves with our tax code because it's just so goddamn dandy. Secondly, it's actually really hard to leave a country. You don't just leave to pursue the lowest marginal tax rates. That's why you don't go to Somalia, right? There are a whole bunch of reasons keeping you in New Zealand. You stay in New Zealand because that's where your land, your business, the things that actually generate your wealth are. You stay here because your family is here, because your community is here, because you like fjords and cows and those other things that we have that other people don't. There are lots of factors that keep people in New Zealand, and we think those are sufficient. We think there will be very few effects of people leaving. So, what were our harms? Tons of them, none of them responded to. Let's go on a little ticky tour. We showed you that the mere presence of inequality creates good schools and bad schools and narratives surrounding the students at those schools, which means they get no political support. Decile 1 schools are treated badly by the rich because their kids do not participate in them. No response to them. Health. We said that people, as shown in the Whitehall studies, get stressed and have negative health effects simply because they are poorer and have lower social status than those around them. No response again from that side of the house. Violence. We told you that societies that have high rates of inequality are more violent, right? That's not something that's good for rich or poor. People feel they need to compete to own as many things as possible, and if you can't earn things because you don't have money, you turn to violence. That's why societies that are more unequal are more violent. Josh.
if you told me that you were going to make an investment and I knew it was bad, do I have a moral obligation to tell you that your investment is not a sound one?
I think you probably do have a moral obligation to tell someone, but you possibly won't enforce that duty. That's why we look at the relative merit of the benefits and harms. In this case, we've shown about 1 billion harms, and you've shown essentially no benefits. So we think it's perfectly right for the government to intervene in that situation. Also, that's a dick thing to do, right? Probably immoral. So, my substantive addition to this debate, politics. The problem with wealth inequality is it actually ends up affecting the very political system we rely on to protect the poor and to protect the vulnerable in our society. Why is that? Because high levels of inequality generally of wealth, result in concentrations of power, and particularly political power. Why? Because economic power translates directly into political power. It allows you to fund ad campaigns and produce donations, but it also gives you powerful economic interests that politicians fear they need to respect. Secondly, rich people, for all the reasons we gave you, are better able to gather the social capital and education to make them effective political actors. They have greater ability to articulate their beliefs, they have greater capacity to participate in the democratic process because they understand it more, and they have greater capacity to understand the issues. So they're more effective political actors. What that means is that rich people lobby extremely well for the interests of rich people, and that's often destructive to the interests of poor people. Why is that? They often wield democracy as a weapon against the poor, and this was the huge complaint of the Occupy Wall Street movement, which is that corporate cronyism and a focus on the interests of business and the rich at the expense of the poor resulted in multiple policy positions that hurt the average American to benefit a tiny minority. That's why the government did nothing to prevent outsourcing. That's why the government focused on debt control rather than stimulus. That's why the government focused on stripping away employment and union benefits to prioritise the rich. You have systematic prioritisations of the interests of the rich above the poor that single-handedly comes from the economic inequalities between those groups. And the problem is that disempowers the poor, because politicians reflect who the most important voters are, not only in how they treat them, but who their character is. That's why all of the politicians you see running are not sort of really, for instance, they're not from South Auckland, right? The people you see running for Prime Minister. And that's because they reflect their benefactors in character and status. And the problem is that alienates the most marginal voters, because they don't feel an affinity to the politicians they're trying to vote for, so they no longer vote. So those are two additional harms to go in our big wheelbarrow of fun. So where do we stand at this point in the debate? We have given you a bajillion reasons why income inequality is bad and provided a solid mechanism. They dropped the ball, and for that reason, they lose this debate.
If I come to your house and take your TV, it is legitimate for you to come and get me and put me in jail. It's legitimate for you to harm or punish someone for the things they do that harm someone else. But Richard conceded that when you do something and you don't harm anyone else, you don't have any direct involvement in their downfall, there is no reason why you have a corresponding obligation to be harmed or to be disadvantaged when you have done nothing wrong. It's not illegal to, for instance, commit adultery, even though that would be a dick move, as Richard says, because at the end of the day, the government can't just put into policy things that upset people or things that you might do which don't contribute to someone's downfall. That is why we've taken this debate, because we've shown you that there's no higher obligation on the rich in the downfall of the poor than there is for any other person in society, and that's why tax rates should be flat. I've got a lot to get through. I'm going to look at the principle and we'll look at policy outcomes. So on the utility of money point, this was the first principal point they made. This was a ridiculous point. By their logic, they would be happy to force a millionaire out of their house and put 5 disadvantaged families in it, because that would, create more utility than the other. That is the actual extent of their point, if you take this logical extension. And that's just totally unfair. They have no conception or no willingness to uphold property rights. But they didn't even believe the utility of money point, because they said, oh well, we're not going to have a maximum wage. By that logic, if you don't have a maximum wage and some people earn more than others, there is, in that, a utility of money argument for redistribution, until you get all incomes to be equal. Because as soon as someone has more money than another, that additional money has more utility to someone else, and it should be redistributed. So they never believed in that argument. Then they raised points about the accident of birth. They said it's unfair. You might be born into a good household, and someone might be born into a bad household. We agree, that's why you should have the equality of opportunity to go to a good school and advance yourself that way. But this is not an argument for strict equality, right? This is just an argument for we need to put money into poor schools rather than put money into the middle class. And that's something we stand for. What you stand for is what inevitably happens when politicians get a whole lot of money, is they use that money where it advantages the people who vote for them. That's how we got working for families. That's how we got interest-free student loans. Those things only help the middle class. They don't help the poorest kid at the Decile 1 school, because there's still no reason why people would vote for it. So we're the team that helps accident birth. You entrench middle class prosperity. Moreover, when you allow the government to decide how to spend the majority of money in a particular country, what do? You get greater arbitrary spending, because the government will just spend that money on what's going to get it like the best vote. So it's going to spend the money on the middle class. But worse, it pays off groups that will help it. So rather than giving money to the poorest in society who have no voice, it gives it to the trade union that will get its members out to vote for it. Lobby groups come in and lobby the government for money, rather than money being spent on what it actually needs to be spent on the economy. You entrench bad spending of money and unfair spending of money to certain groups by allowing politicians who have the influence of the vote and the incentives of the vote to spend that money. The third point we want to raise here is obligation. I've already covered this. Everyone in society doesn't want the poor to have no chance at all. Everyone in this debate wants the poor to have some chance. What we have shown you is that a rich person has no further obligation than a poor person in the poor people's downfall. We had no response from them. They were willing to concede all of this ground. At that point, they support a flat tax that we support, because no one has an increased obligation than any other person. Let's look at policy outcomes. So first was about the economy, and we told you that the government can never know how to spend money in a way that is economically efficient. They spend money based on the social priorities of the particular minister or the lobbies, or who's going to give the best votes to that particular person. That's different to rich people. Rich people spend money on things they want. That is a good thing, because someone has to make something that the rich person buys. There's a carpenter who has to build the boat. There's a taxi driver that will drive that rich person around. That is the best naturally defeating welfare mechanism, because it means that people, when there is rich people, can create jobs that will get the rich people's money off them. That is an economically efficient way to grow the economy, in a way that leads to actual growth rather than random growth in areas that suits the politician's particular fetish. Let's look at evasion. We told you that there are a number of people in New Zealand who evade tax, like Alan Gibb, like Owen Glenn, people who state specifically that they have left this country because our tax rates are higher than other countries. Richard was like, oh well, people love the farms of New Zealand. That's why they stay here. They would miss the cows. They would miss, number 8 wire and so on. The point is, the types of people who really care about that kind of stuff aren't the super wealthy who spend every waking minute making more and more money, right? The types of people who make an incredible amount of wealth are driven and prioritize their wealth, and they're willing to move to places where they don't get taxed by punitive rates. Then they were like, well, we're just going to close all loopholes. There'll be no problem. We can just close all tax loopholes that exist in all of society. Richard, you can't just do that. If it was that simple to close all loopholes, right? Every government everywhere would have done that, right? That you would have put Liechtenstein and Switzerland out of business. Those countries' economies wouldn't exist because people wouldn't stash their money there. But even if you get rid of those loopholes, people will still just break them and not tell anyone about it, right? And maybe you'll catch some of them. But there are very tricky ways that you can move money through international bank transfers and so on, which happen on a day-to-day basis, and we can never catch them all. You increase the incentive to do that as you increase tax rates. Yeah.
Surely the rich man has a greater duty to help the beggar who knocks on his door than the poor man, because the rich man has a greater capacity to help.
But you don't believe that, Richard, as I showed earlier, because you don't believe that everyone should have the equality of wealth. If you actually believe that, you would set a maximum and minimum one type of salary in order that everyone would have the equal, the rich man helped just as much as everyone else. So you don't believe that, Richard. But let's look more at evasion. They're just like, we'll broaden the tax base, we'll make their capital gains tax. All those things hurt the poor. If you increase GST, if you increase capital gains tax, that harms the poor person who has to use the money in order to buy some goods. If you increase capital gains tax, it's the ordinary person who has a family home, who has that tax and has to have that tax sold, or inherited tax, has to sell that house in order to pay the tax. We think that broadening the tax base is code for harming the poor through new taxes that they can't hire advice on and can't get around. Then they talked about jealousy. They said people People are jealous. They break stuff when they don't have things. That concedes all of our material, which is that people want money, and that is why they work, and that is why when you increase the marginal tax rates for things, people stop working. You agree that people predominantly go after money. But more importantly, if people break stuff and are violent, we should arrest them and crack down on that, right? Because we should never just pander to those people by saying, all right, you want to break stuff, well, we'll give you a whole lot of handouts. The natural response to that is that these people are breaking the law and we should crack down on them. And with regard to all of their schools point, we deny that many people at all use private schools and that their willingness, their political capital is desperately needed. It's predominantly middle-class people who use public schools. Only the extreme super wealthy use private schools. At the point at which you force them to use public schools, you barely increase any sort of vote, any sort of proportion of the vote that would help make the public schools better. And they said this increases buy-in for the lower class, well, it also harms buy-in for the upper class, so you get no benefit in that sense. This debate is about what's fair. When you have no additional obligation to anyone else, you should not have to pay more tax. We negate.
That all of us have to ensure that poor people aren't precariously poor. And the problem with that was, of course we agree. Of course we wouldn't leave somebody dying or hungry in the street. Of course that's what we don't stand for on our side of the house. That means that both sides are in agreement upon whether or not we have some basic obligation to the poor. And that's why you didn't get a response, because we agree. But where we differ is that we say that those people who have spent their time and effort and investment to make a whole lot of profits, we disagree that they have any obligation over and above an ordinary level of obligation, such as to avoid basically being dicks and making dick moves. So we say that we don't have that duty over and above everyone else. So I'm going to look at fairness, I'm going to look at whether or not we're even collecting more tax, because if we can show you that we're not, then they don't win the debate anyway, and finally I'm going to look at who uses the money better. So on whether or not we have a duty, we already told you that we agreed with all of their harms of inequality. We agree with their points about education, we agree with their points of violence. The reason that we don't press those on our side of the house is because we think that those things are sufficiently taken care of when you have a 20% flat tax and you can provide equality of opportunity to everyone in society through things like universal healthcare, through universal education, through a basic level of sustenance welfare. So we say that we shouldn't subject rich people to moral duties over and above ordinary moral duties just because of the fact that they have the extra capacity. And the only response they gave to that was when Richard was like, well, we think an omission is just as bad as an act. The problem with that is to prove you have a liability or an obligation through an omission, you still have to have some sort of special relationship or association to the person who is less well off, to the person whom you owe an obligation to. And we say that that relationship hasn't been created. They've never been able to prove that a super wealthy person owes any kind of special relationship or has any special association with a poor person. So beyond the fact that it would be a dick move not to give them that money, we don't think that they've proved that. So we say there's no duty, and we would support getting rid of inequality through existing mechanisms. Secondly, are you even collecting more tax? And we showed you that you aren't. We told you you are less likely to work as much if you have to pay that tax. And they just came back and they were like, well, people work for a whole lot of other reasons, not just money. First of all, Josh told you that actually we think most people work for the paycheck at the end of the day. But secondly, we told you that at the point at which working more would mean that that you don't actually get more money because the amount of tax you're paying erodes that extra income that you get. We think people are inclined to work less, so you get less tax revenue there. We told you that people are more inclined to evade tax, and they just came out and said, well, we have anti-avoidance provisions. Yeah, Richard, if we have anti-avoidance provisions that are working so well, why do we still have a huge amount of tax avoidance and tax evasion in society? We have it because we think rich people are the best at hiring really good tax lawyers, really good trust specialists to structure their affairs in a way that they don't have to pay as much tax. We told you that people will send this money offshore to places like the Cayman Islands who really pride themselves on the fact that they have a comparative advantage in being tax havens, which is is why they won't fall in line with New Zealand if New Zealand were to impose their policy. And finally, we gave you a number of examples of high wealth individuals who have left New Zealand to take advantage of lower tax rates overseas, and we're not happy to stand for that brain drain. So we've shown you that you don't actually even collect more tax under their model, so they can't win the debate on that front. Finally, we gave you a lot of analysis about why we think rich people spend the money better than governments. Josh told you about how the government kowtows to the middle class swing voters on things like working for families and other forms of middle class welfare. We say that that's not okay when you could leave it to the rich people who would use it to buy goods and services, invest in things that give other people in the economy jobs. We say that leaving that money to the wealthy people who are able to actually use it to have a trickle-down effect into society, give people jobs, give people an income, and allow that wealth to be spread far better than anything that they're proposing is a much better system, and for that reason, we oppose.
We've been waiting on the side of the house. In fact, we've been waiting since the 1980s, even though we weren't actually alive, for the trickle-down to come. And I don't even feel a drop of the wealth falling upon me at this stage. 3 questions left for you at the end of the debate. First of all, who gets the biggest tax take? Second of all, whose principles actually make sense? Easy answer to that one. Thirdly, outcomes and who produces a better society. Again, it's probably clear to you by this stage already, but I have a few minutes, so let's have a chat. First of all, about the tax take. If they actually believed their principle that nobody had any greater obligation to help than any other person, why do they even use a percentage of taxation? If they actually believe that, they charge everybody like $500 tax because nobody has any greater obligation than $500. But ignoring that like obvious niggle in the problem, they had 2 particular oppositions to this idea. The first one was that people were going to flee the country, and Josh's justification for that was people really love wealth and they're focused on wealth so much that they will uproot all of the other things that they might like in their life, all of the things that mean to live in a community, all of the things like family and friends and associations with your culture and the like. We painted you a broader picture of what it meant to try and avoid tax, or what it meant to decide when your marginal tax rate was too high. We also painted you a broader tax base, which we thought would reduce the chances of that kind of thing happening. All of their examples of diminished tax takes were tied to income tax changes. Those points didn't really make sense at the end of the day. We're confident with our taxation powers we can make some money. Let's talk now about principles, because at this stage, Josh actually showed up to the debate in lieu of his first partner in Nepal, but it turned out that he didn't actually have much to add. Because what he said was quite simply this: if you don't believe in communism, you obviously can't support this policy, because utilitarianism at the extreme means that you'd have to take away everybody's chance at earning more money than anybody else. Our response to this was quite simple. We had a trifecta of moral obligations which we said were important to balance. Richard told you that we assess a policy and the duties incumbent in that policy on whether or not it produces good outcomes. We said that there were strong moral reasons and good outcomes to be had as a result of this policy, and so we thought we could believe in it without necessarily believing in communism. He then said that the wealthy never harmed anybody, that they owe nothing to anybody, and he sounded and looked just like Ayn Rand as he said it. The problem with that is that there's a gigantic opportunity cost, which they never understood. The very fact that I have enough money to go to university simply means that that's money which the state hasn't been able to take away from me in order to distribute that to people who might need it more. That's the opportunity cost. That's why being wealthy harms other people. Moreover, here's the outcomes, because we said that the very existence of inequality, the very existence of extreme wealth was harmful to everybody in society. Why was that? That was because of the health outcomes that were a result of inequalities of wealth, not simply the absolute standards. That was because of the educational discrepancies as a result of inequalities of wealth, not simply absolute standards. That was because of violence in the United States is 60 times higher than in Japan, a country which is significantly more equal, because people are violent when what is rightfully theirs, what is rightfully their fair share of the fruits of our community was unjustly deprived from them. We live in a community, everybody, and we have an opportunity to make this community significantly better without harming anybody, unless you consider denying somebody the privilege of their 3rd mega yacht to be a significant harm. I don't. I hope you agree.
Thank you very much to our teams from Victoria University and the University of Auckland for a spirited debate. We now have to give our adjudicators a few minutes to consider the outcome of the debate. In the meantime, please just continue the discussion.